This happened on New Year's Eve back in 2019. I'm from a small town in Montana, not far from Missoula, and I was flying home after finishing a semester at the University of Oregon. My semester had ended later than usual because of a snowstorm, so I spent Christmas alone on campus, which only added to my sour mood. The flight back was uneventful, but the delay meant I missed my family's holiday plans. I had been looking forward to our annual trip to my uncle's cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. When my flight was rescheduled, my parents decided to head up to the cabin without me, leaving me with our family's old Labrador, Boone, and the spare truck to make the trip solo. By the time I landed and an Uber dropped me at the house, it was almost 10 p.m. I grabbed my duffel bag, shoved it into the back of the truck, and whistled for Boone. He hopped in without hesitation, his tail wagging like he knew we were headed somewhere exciting. The drive started off as nothing special, just miles of deserted backroads weaving through the foothills. Snow flurries dusted the ground and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the world shrouded in darkness. Boone sat contentedly in the passenger seat, occasionally huffing at shadows outside the window. About halfway to the cabin, Boone started whining. At first I thought he wanted attention, but then he shifted nervously, scratching at the door. He needed to go. I sighed and pulled over into a narrow clearing. The space was barely wide enough for the truck, but it would have to do. I opened the door and Boone hopped out, sniffing around the edge of the tree line. The cold air bit at my face as I stood by the truck, keeping an eye on him. That's when I heard a deep, deliberate crunching sound, like something heavy moving through the snow-covered underbrush. I froze, my eyes scanning the woods. The darkness seemed to press in closer, and my breath clouded in the freezing air. Boone stiffened, his ears perking up. Before I could stop him, he bolted into the woods, barking furiously. "Boone," I shouted, but he disappeared into the blackness. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. It wasn't much help, the beam barely cut through the dense forest. Still, I couldn't leave Boone out there, not alone. I plunged into the woods after him, my boots crunching loudly against the icy ground. The cold air burned my lungs as I called his name over and over. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, save for my own footsteps and ragged breathing. Then I heard Boone's bark, sharp, frantic, and much closer than I expected. I pushed forward, stumbling over roots and low branches, until I saw him. He was crouched low, his body trembling, staring into the shadows ahead. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around him, relief flooding through me. But as I turned to head back, I heard it again, crunching footsteps, this time behind us. The sound was deliberate, measured, and far too close. Boone growled low in his throat, a sound I'd never heard from him before. Without thinking, I grabbed his collar and ran, blindly crashing through the trees. The footsteps followed, growing louder, faster. Adrenaline fueled me as I followed Boone, who darted ahead like he knew the way. I stumbled into the clearing and saw the truck, a beacon of safety in the pitch-black night. I threw the door open, practically shoving Boone inside before diving into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. As I turned the key in the ignition, my eyes flicked to the edge of the woods. My heart stopped. 3 figures stood there, barely illuminated by the truck's headlights. They didn't move, just watched as I tore out of the clearing and sped down the road. It wasn't until I was miles away that I noticed Boone was bleeding. A thin, jagged cut ran along his side, just below his ribs. My hand shook as I grabbed the first aid kit from the glove box and did my best to patch him up. Boone whimpered but didn't resist, his eyes wide and scared. The rest of the drive was a blur. When I finally reached the cabin, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Even now, I can't explain it, and I'm not sure I want to. But every New Year's Eve since, I've stayed close to home, and I never drive those back roads alone. I've never been one for big parties. Even in college, the whole going-out culture got old fast. I preferred doing something meaningful with a few close friends. And honestly, I still do. This story takes place in the dead of winter a couple of years ago. I'm from northwestern Ontario, a place where winters are harsh and traditions are hard to break. Growing up, my dad had this unusual New Year's tradition, ice fishing. While everyone else was out celebrating in crowded bars or at family gatherings, my dad, his brother, and a few friends would head out to a frozen lake with nothing but their gear and a thermos of coffee to keep them warm. My mom wasn't in the picture, and we didn't have much family nearby, so I spent every New Year's Eve with them on the ice. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. When my dad passed a few years ago, I felt this strange need to keep the tradition alive. My brother had moved to Chicago by then, so I roped in my two best friends, Nate and Trevor. They're both rugged outdoorsy types, the kind of guys who are more comfortable in flannel and snow boots than in suits and ties. Together, we made it our mission to keep the tradition alive. That year, Nate was driving. His truck was perfect for the job: big tires, four-wheel drive, and plenty of space for our gear. We had everything: rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled to haul it all, and a small pop-up shelter to shield us from the worst of the cold. The weather forecast promised a clear night, but anyone who's spent a winter in Ontario knows better than to trust that. The lake we were heading to was off the beaten path, surrounded by thick forest. It wasn't well known, and that's exactly why we loved it. It felt untouched, like it was ours alone. As Nate navigated the winding back roads, the excitement started to build. But that excitement faded the moment we pulled up to the trailhead. There was a man standing there just a few yards away, bundled up in heavy winter gear. He wasn't moving, just standing there staring at us. At first I thought he might be another fisherman, but then he glanced at his phone, then back at us, then at his phone again. Something about it felt off. I muttered to Nate and Trevor, "That guy's creeping me out." Trevor shrugged it off, but Nate was watching him closely. We were about to start unloading our gear when the man suddenly sprinted toward us, waving his arms and shouting. "You gotta help me," he yelled, his voice frantic. My buddy just fell through the ice. He held up his phone as if to show proof. The desperation in his voice made my stomach twist. Before I could think, Trevor opened his door and we were all out of the truck, following the man down the trail toward the lake. We didn't even grab our coats. The man was moving fast, too fast. We had to jog to keep up, and as we got closer to the lake, something started to feel very wrong. He wasn't leading us to the usual fishing spots. Instead, we were heading toward a more remote part of the shoreline, where the ice was thinner. I wanted to stop, to tell the others something wasn't right, but it was too late. They appeared out of nowhere. Two more men were standing at the edge of the lake, dressed in mismatched winter clothes. They weren't moving, just watching us approach. My eyes went straight to their hands. Both of them were armed. "Stop right there," one of them shouted, raising his gun and pointing it directly at me. I froze. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The man who had led us there turned to face us, a smirk spreading across his face. We'd been set up. The second guy barked at Nate, demanding his keys and everything we had on us. We didn't have a choice. Nate tossed his keys over, and the three of us emptied our pockets. I tried to hold onto my phone, but one of them noticed. "Phones, too," he said, his voice icy. Nate lied, saying his was in the truck. They laughed but didn't press the issue. I was furious. My fists were clenched so tight my knuckles hurt. I wanted to fight back, but with two guns pointed at us, there was nothing we could do. They marched us back up the trail at gunpoint. One of them jumped into Nate's truck and sped off, while the others disappeared into the woods. We stood there, shivering in the bitter cold, too stunned to speak. Then Nate pulled out his phone. He'd lied. His phone wasn't in the truck. He called the police, explaining everything as best as he could. The dispatcher told us to stay put, so we huddled together for warmth, waiting for help to arrive. Nate was furious, kicking at nearby trees and cursing under his breath. Trevor and I were still too shocked to say much. The police showed up about an hour later. They took our statements and gave us a ride back to Trevor's house. Nate's truck was never found, and those men were never caught. To this day, we still don't know what they were doing out there or why they targeted us. Trevor thinks it was a crime of opportunity, that we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I don't buy it. That spot was too remote. They had to be waiting for someone, waiting for us. What I'm about to tell you is something that still haunts me, especially around this time of year. It happened on New Year's Eve in 2020, when I was driving to visit my sister Marcy at her cabin in northern Vermont. I live in Boston, so it was about a 4-hour trip, and I'd planned to arrive just in time for the countdown. The drive started peacefully. I'd left in the late afternoon, cruising along quiet highways while listening to an old playlist Marcy had made for me years ago. The snow began falling about an hour into the drive. At first, it was nothing more than a picturesque flurry dusting the windshield. It felt like the perfect backdrop to end the year. but the snow didn't stop. It came down harder and harder until I was in the middle of a full-blown blizzard. The highway transformed into an ice rink, and visibility dropped to near zero. My car, an old Subaru that had seen better days, wasn't equipped for conditions like this. The tires struggled to grip the road, sliding on even the smallest inclines. I knew I had to pull over before I ended up in a ditch or worse. I found a spot on the shoulder, far enough from the road to avoid passing cars. Though there weren't many out in this storm, I texted Marcy to let her know what was happening. She offered to come get me, but I immediately shut that idea down. It was too dangerous. I told her I'd wait it out and see if the storm let up. Hours passed, and the snow didn't ease. It piled up around my car, isolating me completely. The wind howled, rocking the Subaru like a toy. My phone battery was dwindling, and I was starting to worry about running out of gas while trying to stay warm. The sense of unease grew heavier with every passing minute. Then I saw them headlights cutting through the storm in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as a snowplow pulled up alongside my car. The driver rolled down his window and motioned for me to do the same. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and a thick gray beard. He wore a battered wool coat and a fur-lined hat pulled low over his ears. He had an air of calm about him that made me feel instantly safer, even as the storm raged around us. "You stuck?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. "Yeah," I said. "My car can't handle this. I'm supposed to be heading north to my sister's cabin, but I don't think I can make it." He nodded, scanning the car's interior. "You won't get far in this storm," he said. "I can give you a ride if you want. My route takes me through a few back roads. It'll be safer than sticking around here." I hesitated. Climbing into a stranger's vehicle in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly ideal, but neither was freezing to death in my car. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the plow. At first, the warmth of the cab was a welcome relief. I told the driver where I was headed, and he nodded, saying he knew the area well. But as the minutes passed, I started to feel uneasy. The silence between us was heavy, and the way he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye made my skin crawl. It wasn't until we left the main road that my unease turned into full-blown fear. I glanced at the GPS on my phone and realized we were heading in the wrong direction. The route to Marcy's cabin was straightforward. This was anything but. "I think we're going the wrong way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're just taking a detour," he replied without looking at me. "Back roads are safer in this kind of weather." I didn't believe him. The GPS kept recalculating, showing turn after missed turn. I started scanning the cab for anything that could help me if things went south. That's when I noticed the knife tucked into the door pocket and the door pocket, and the empty whiskey bottles rolling around near his feet. My heart began pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. We passed a small farmhouse, its porch light glowing faintly through the storm. It was the first sign of life I'd seen in miles, and I knew it was my only chance. I gripped the door handle, waiting for the right moment. When the truck slowed to navigate a bend, I yanked the door open and threw myself into the snow. Pain shot through my leg as I hit the ground, but I forced myself to my feet and ran toward the farmhouse. Behind me, I heard the driver shout something, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the porch and pounded on the door, screaming for help. A middle-aged couple answered, their faces pale with shock as they pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, and tried to explain what had happened. The police arrived about an hour later, but the snowplow and its driver were gone. They searched the area but found nothing. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he had planned, but I know one thing for sure. If I hadn't jumped out of that truck when I did, I might not be here to tell this story.